Okay, so we're going to do a little show and tell on netilas yadayim, on washing our hands, and the proper way to do so. It's one of those mitzvahs we do all the time, and there's a lot of details that go into it, and sometimes you can do a little bit quickly, just out of habit, and not take the time to focus on doing it properly and doing it right. So today we'll try to do that. And before we start, I wanted to share with you about a specific detail that will come up soon. One of the details we're going to learn is this idea of holding the towel as you wash your hands. We're going to talk about that in a second. And here I'm quoting from the Rabbi, who writes, this custom to when we wash our hands before we eat and to wash our hands 3 times while holding a towel. Now, once upon a time, when one asked if they should do this, they were sometimes told, this is beyond you, this is a big chumrah, this is a high level, it's not for you to wash with such particular, with the towel being so holy, it's not for you. This is what people were told in the past. In fact, the Rabbi doesn't say this here, but in fact, in the older generations, in CHABAD in particular, there was something that Hasidim tried to avoid. It was called blitas. Blitas means to protrude, which means to stand out, to show off, look how holy I am. And so Hasidim would actually avoid sometimes, certainly in public, doing these chumras, doing these higher levels, because it looked like they were. Anyway, back to the quote here. But today, says the Rebbe, the custom by all Hasidim is to do this, to wash 3 times and to hold a towel, and this has become an accepted practice and normal. To the point, says the Rebbe, that I heard that there are some homes in which which the women and daughters also wash their hands with a towel, which is a hidur, it's like a high level, which in some circles even the great Rabbanim don't do. But because they're Chassidish women, they do it. That's how far the Rebbe goes with this. So with that in mind, we'll walk through some of the details of washing our hands and do a little demo. So we wash our hands actually twice. There's 2 types of washing for our hands. One is in the morning, and one is before meal. We'll start with the one before meal, and you'll see why when we get to washing our hands in the morning. We'll see why we started with the washing our hands before a meal. So when it comes to washing our hands before a meal, first of all, I should note that in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law, it's 8 chapters with hundreds of halachas. We're not going to go through all of them, because the Code of Jewish Law, first of all, goes through what's the bare minimum, what's the higher levels, what's the even higher levels, and the Shulchan Aruch also goes through hypotheticals that in most cases you don't have to deal with, like what if you don't have running water, what if you're traveling, if all you have is snow, if all you have is a river, if you don't have a cup, if your cup has a hole in it, if you have a pitcher, if the water is murky, all kinds of hypotheticals that come up in the Code of Jewish Law that's discussed in these 8 chapters, which we're not going to discuss, because that would, first of all, take way too long, and secondly, because most of these things we don't have to worry about. We all have these little things at home, we all have sinks at home, so most of these problems, for most of the time, are not so much an issue. So we're kind of going straight to the highest level of what it looks like to wash your hands if you're keeping all the highest level of observance, as per the comment we just said from the Rebbe, where they're encouraging that we do take the highest standard, notwithstanding, meaning forget about whether you're showing off or not, just do it the right way. So we wash our hands before we eat, and the reason is this is a rabbinic commandment. Before we eat bread, specifically, thank you, that's correct, before we eat bread. Also before we eat anything that's wet, but we're going to leave that aside for right now. But certainly before you eat bread, right? So in the halachas actually discusses what kind of bread, how much bread, and all that, which again we're not discussing today. And the reason for this mitzvah, it's a rabbinic mitzvah, which means it's not biblical. And the reason for the mitzvah is because in temple times, there's a whole section of halacha that today basically is not part of our life. And that is the halachas of purity and impurity, tumah and tara. For the most part, it's not part of our life. There's nothing wrong with becoming tummy. We've all been to funerals, so we're all impure. None of us have been sprinkled with the ashes of a red heifer, so we're all impure. It just means we're barred from going to the temple. Okay, so we're not going to the temple. Right? Many don't even go to the Temple Mount because of that, for that reason. If you did go to the Temple Mount, you might see a sign there which says, don't walk past this point, because that's where they assume the temple used to stand, and you can't walk past that point because we're all impure. But for the most part, purity and impurity is not relevant to us because we're not going to the temple, and that would be the only reason to become ritually pure. But in an effort to keep us engaged with that type of halacha, and so that this halacha doesn't disappear from us, our sages instituted that everybody should wash their hands before they eat bread. Because hands, as being impure, is the most common impurity, specifically when it comes to eating truma, even though eating the tithe that's given to the kohen, even though it's only for the kohen to eat, nonetheless, using this as a kind of model that we all wash our hands before we eat bread, as they would have in those times when the kohen was eating truma, is a way for us to remember these halachas, and when Mashiach comes, it's not so unfamiliar to us, washing our hands before we eat, or going to the mikveh, and so on. That's the basic reason for the mitzvah of washing our hands. The Alter Rebbe, in addition to his code of Jewish law, wrote a siddur, compiled a siddur, and in this siddur it also has many basic laws, and some of which are a little different from the code, and in the siddur he's much more stringent on a higher level than he is in the code of Jewish law, which sometimes stays more basic. In the code of Jewish law, he has a section called netilat yadayim lesa'уда, or something like that, which means the order of how to wash your hands before a meal, and some of the halachas in brief. Most of what we're sharing with you comes from that there, along with some letters from Rebbe and Sefer Menhagim. That section, that part begins with a quote from the Gemara and Rashi, which says that being particular about washing one's hands for a meal, and in particular, making sure to use a lot of water, and not being stingy on the water, prevents poverty, keeps poverty at bay. So we can keep that in mind. Being particular of washing our hands before the meal, especially not being stingy on the water and making sure you get your whole hand covered, as we'll explain, keeps poverty away, which we all want that to stay away. Okay, so as a preparation for washing our hands, number one, we have to have the right cup. We're not going to discuss the laws of the cup because we assume you have a washing cup at home. We're going to assume that. You have to make sure you have clean water. We assume your tap is in Quebec and it's clean. One also has to be careful that their hands don't have any chatzitza. That is nothing that separates between the hands and the water, especially as it gets under the nails. The Shulchan Aruch particularly talks about that, cleaning one's nails before one to wash their hands. I remember once I was in yeshiva, and this is the first time I watched, or not the first time I watched, it's the wrong way to put it. It's a particular time which I paid attention to an individual who really was scrupulous about the laws of washing one's hands. So Rabbi Raskin from London, he came to Detroit, and he fabrang Shabbos afternoon. The plan was he was going to wash before Shkia and fabrang into Matzah Shabbos. Change of plans, he's not washing. Why aren't you washing? Because in the middle of Shabbos, his nail broke, and he was concerned with the not being able to clean his nail properly without breaking his nail before he washed, so he wouldn't wash. This is like a Jew taking the code of Jewish law very seriously. It was something that stuck out to me. It's also important that a person's hands be actually dry before they start washing their hands. So if you have to use water to wash your hands because you want to get rid of any separation between your hands and the water, you have to make sure it's dried up as well before you start again, before you start wash your hands ritually. And likewise, if while you're washing your hands you accidentally touch something you're not supposed to touch, dry your hands and start over. Because when we wash our hands should be dry, especially if you're coming, let's say, from the bathroom, and you washed your hands and you said Asher Yatzar, your hands are still wet, you got to make sure they're dry. Likewise, as we're going to learn in a second, you're supposed to pick up the cup with your right hand. You're supposed to start everything with your right hand. So you pick it up with your right hand, then you got to wash your right hand first too. So you pass it to your left hand, then you wash your right hand. And when you do that, your right hand may have been wet because it just touched the washing cup, which you were holding while it was being filled up by the sink, let's say. So before you wash, make sure you dry your hands on the towel that's available to you. So you really have to be ready to do the ritual washing. So I'm going to go through the details of what they are, and then I'll do a little demonstration. So first of all, we pick it up on our right hand, pass it to our left hand after our hands are clean. And then when you wash your hands, you want to make sure that each time, the CHABAD custom is to pour 3 times. Others do only twice. The CHABAD custom is to do 3 times. Each time you pour, you want to get, again, we're talking about the optimal way of doing it. You want to get your entire hand wet in one pour. So while you're still pouring once, you want to get your entire hand wet. That is to say, all your fingers down to your wrist. You want to make sure that the water that pours onto your hand doesn't roll off your hand. This is how detailed it gets. And then roll back onto your hand, because that water which you poured onto your hand is impure, and if it comes back, it makes your hand impure again. So you want to make sure that the water rolls off your hand, not down in your hand. Which means, says the Shulchan Aruch, you hold your hands a little up. So it says actually to hold your fingers up, and that way the rest of your hand is tilted up, and that way the water pours downward, not the other way. So that impure water doesn't accidentally, let's say you're pouring it and it went past your wrist, that water's impure and rolls down to your hands, which is just become purified. So you hold your hand a little up. Number 2 is you want to get your entire hand wet in each pour. So you twist your hand a little bit. Yeah? So it's a little up, 1, 2, 3, and then you're washing your other hand. You don't want to touch, with that hand just became pure, you don't want to touch any liquid that's not pure, which would mean you don't want to hold the washing cup. Hence, using the towel to hold the washing cup. And then you're doing the same thing on your left side, once, twice, 3 times, with your hand tilted up. And in your left hand, this is the CHABAD custom, you catch a little water at the end. Actually, the halacha is you have to rub your hands together. After you finish washing, you're supposed to rub your hands together. That's the halacha. The CHABAD custom is to catch a little water in the left hand, use that water to rub around in the hand, and then, actually to make the bracha, just before you start rubbing your hands together, al natilas yadayim, and if you're washing in the sink so your hands are lower, the CHABAD custom is to raise it up to the level of your heart and make the bracha there. And then when you're done, this is part of the halacha as well. Make sure I missed anything. Did I miss anything? No? And then when you're done, as part of the halacha is to actually dry your hands very, very well, on account of a number of things, but primarily because one is not allowed to touch bread with wet hands, as that makes the bread soggy, and that is halacha against defiling bread. It's actually a set of halachas about not defiling bread. So that's the details, and now for show and tell. So this is how it goes, and I'll walk you through what I'm doing as I do it, without getting the bima wet, hopefully. All right? So I brought 2 here, in case. So this helps you if you have your towel ready beforehand, right? So you also want to probably do this, so you don't get your hands too wet, or your shirt. Okay, so again, you're picking it up with your right hand, right? You're passing it to your left hand. You have your fingers are somewhat separated, so the water gets everywhere. Your fingers are tilted upward like that, rather than downward like this. And with each pour, you're twisting your hands 3 times. So just do 1, you'll kind of get the idea, right? And that way, all of your hand gets wet in 1 pour as you twist it. Now, what I just did was I touched this as I was turning, which would mean the halacha would be now I have to dry my hand and start all over again. That would be the way we do it. But assuming we didn't touch it and then like that 3 times, and the same thing on the left, using a towel, because I don't want to touch anything that is wet with that hand who just became pure. And the same thing, I'm tilting my hands upward, my finger upward, separated, and with each pour, the full water all the way around, getting my hands. And then the 3rd time, as I mentioned, you're catching a little water in your hand, and the bracha, just before you rub your hands together, while you're holding your hand at the level of your heart. So that would be the proper way to wash one's hands before a meal. I think now it's time for mincha. And afterwards, after mincha, we'll do a little demo on how to wash your hands in the morning, which is actually even more difficult, if you can imagine.